My name is Aidan Rhodes. I am Policy Briefing Papers Research Fellow at the Energy Futures Lab, and I'd like very much to welcome you to our presentation today. So just a few things before we get going properly. This event will last 1 hour. There'll be a presentation of about 20 minutes, followed by a discussion with our invited guests. You can submit questions for the panel through the Q&A function on the top right-hand side of your screen. Please also like the questions that you'd most like the panel to address, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time that we've got. This event is also being recorded and will be made available on the Energy Futures Lab YouTube channel shortly after the events. The report is also now available to download. You will have received a link with the joining instructions today, and we'll also post a link to the Q&A so you can directly look at the report. And finally, this report was commissioned by the MCS Charitable Foundation. We're delighted that Dr. Richard Huxwell-Baldwin, who is Research and Campaigns Officer at MCS, has agreed to chair today's event. So without further ado, I'll hand over to him now to get us underway. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Aidan, for that. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the launch event for the latest Energy Futures Lab briefing paper, The Future of Home Heating, the Roles of Heat Pumps and Hydrogen, produced by Imperial College Consultants. I'm Richard Hawkswell-Baldwin, the Research and Campaigns Officer for the MCS Charitable Foundation. We're an independent UK-wide charity with a mission to accelerate the widespread adoption of renewable energy and low-carbon technologies. As you'll all know, there's been a lot of debate in recent months regarding the future of home heating, with a flurry of new academic and think tank reports, along with a number of significant government policy announcements, including the UK hydrogen and heat and building strategies, and the Scottish heat in building strategy and draft hydrogen action plan. More recently, of course, the surge in gas prices has thrown a further spotlight onto the issue of how we will heat our homes in the future. And of course, this is all in the context of the transition to net zero as part of the UK's efforts to tackle climate change. As we're all too aware by now, to mitigate the dangerous effects of climate change and keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, it's vitally important to embark on far-reaching, ambitious efforts to decarbonise the UK's economy and infrastructure. And with heating accounting for around 23% of UK emissions, this is an obvious and urgent area in need of decarbonising. But at the same time, there's been a lot of debate as to how to decarbonise home heating to help make our homes fit for the future and tackle climate change. So we commissioned Imperial College Consultants to synthesise the latest research on the roles of heat pumps and hydrogen in home heating to provide some clarity on the way forward over this crucial decade. We're delighted that so many of you have joined us this afternoon to hear the paper's authors Amy Trask, Dr. Richard Hanna and Dr. Aidan Rhodes discuss their work, and then from our expert panel comprised of Caroline Bragg, Director of Policy and Research at the Association for Decentralised Energy, Dr. Jan Rosnow, Principal and Director of European Programmes at the Regulatory Assistant Project, and Dr. Nixon Sunny, a researcher with the Centre for Environmental Policy at Imperial College London. The panel will be giving us their views on the issue following the author's presentation, along with answering as many of your questions as time permits towards the end of the session. So, with the agenda for the next hour set, I'd like to hand over to the paper's authors to discuss their work with us all. Amy, over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Richard and Aidan, for the wonderful introductions. Today, as Richard mentioned, today myself and one of my co-authors, Dr. Richard Hanna, will be presenting the findings from our report on the future of UK heating. So, as it stands, the UK's heat network is heavily reliant on natural gas, and the sector is responsible for approximately 23% of national carbon dioxide emissions. The graph on the right illustrates UK's dependence on natural gas as a feedstock, it being one of the highest in Europe, coming second only to the Netherlands. In combination with the fact that heating demand varies both daily and seasonally, this means it requires a flexible solution, and that decarbonising domestic heat is perhaps more challenging than other sectors, such as the power sector, for example. But in our efforts to reach net zero, it is of the utmost importance. The report and this presentation will focus on the deployment of heat pumps or hydrogen grid and discuss their low carbon alternatives to the current situation and what roles that they may play in the future. We'll discuss the various advantages, challenges and technicalities surrounding the two technologies, by drawing on their supply and demand side characteristics, as well as looking at potential barriers and how policy may help overcome them. The overall aim is to produce a set of recommendations that prioritise key areas that require addressing over the next decade. The report is a result of extensive literature reviews on the subject matter, alongside stakeholder interviews and interviews carried out with industry experts and academics. A quick disclaimer: whilst we acknowledge the importance of demand reduction, energy efficiency and heat networks in the net zero transition, they're not considered in depth in the scope of the report. I'll touch on them briefly in the next slide as we look at the general barriers that we face in decarbonising domestic heat in the UK. So, when it comes to decarbonising domestic heat, some of the general barriers that we'll face, regardless of the technology that we choose, are building energy efficiency, industry skills and training, and public awareness. The UK's housing stock is one of the oldest and least thermally efficient in Europe. There is an urgent need, therefore, to improve the thermal efficiency of UK buildings, both as a means to reduce heating demand and to optimise performance of heat pumps or hydrogen boilers. In terms of industry skills and training, there are currently significant shortages of skilled workers in heat pump installation and maintenance. And on top of this, the gas installers don't currently have the necessary skills or training for the installation of hydrogen boilers. The current UK skill base in heating and energy efficiency industries needs to be scaled up, regardless of which technology we choose. In terms of public awareness, there's a low carbon or alternative heating systems remain unfamiliar and poorly understood amongst general public. A survey of 2,000 customers carried out by the Energy Systems Catapult revealed that only half of respondents were aware of low carbon heating. Many thought that it would be extremely expensive, and some weren't even aware that natural gas boilers contributed towards climate change. So you might ask yourself, why hydrogen? Well, one of the appeals of hydrogen is that at the point of use, there are no carbon dioxide emissions produced. As well as this, if it's deployable, a hydrogen grid could mirror the usage of natural gas within homes. However, currently the way we produce hydrogen is not sustainable. Currently, 97% of hydrogen is reliant on fossil fuels worldwide, and this results in 830 million tonnes of carbon dioxide being emitted per year. And this is the same amount of the emissions of the UK and Indonesia combined. Hydrogen, the way it's produced, is often denoted by a colour. For example, the most common colour is known as grey hydrogen, which uses natural gas as a feedstock. A hydrogen approach would require low carbon alternatives to be effective in lowering emissions. The most promising alternatives at the moment to traditional hydrogen production are known as green or blue hydrogen. So blue hydrogen combines fossil fuel production, such as black and grey, with carbon capture and storage, whereas green uses electrolysis to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Whereas grey produces around 9 to 12 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of hydrogen produced. This figure is around 3 for blue hydrogen, depending on your carbon capture and storage rates, and it's even lower for green, around 1 to 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of hydrogen produced. The current hydrogen production capacity in the UK is about 3 to 5 gigawatts, and this is used in industry. The UK's current industrial strategy for decarbonisation plans to utilise what are called low carbon industrial clusters. So these are places where there's like a coordinated effort between industries to locate to one area, reducing the cost of the decarbonisation. So if it was theoretically possible to produce enough low carbon hydrogen to supply the UK, we'd need a means of distributing it. One way this could be done is through repurposing the current natural gas grid, which consists of transmission, distribution, and service pipelines. A switch to hydrogen, however, isn't as simple as a like-for-like swap between natural gas and hydrogen. The suitability of the pipeline to carry hydrogen depends on its material, pressure, age, and also condition of the pipework. It is important to note there's currently a program underway which started in 2002 and will end in 2032, called the Iron Mains Replacement Program, and this aims to replace all iron pipe work but with polyethylene pipes, which are plastic and they're more adept to carrying hydrogen. However, once this is complete, we still need to replace the high-strength steel pipelines if we wish to repurpose the transmission pipeline, and this will come at a large cost. A transition to 100% hydrogen in any given area, therefore, will cause some level of disruption to householders in existing properties. Post-installation, consumers are likely to experience the use of hydrogen boiler as relatively familiar technology, given the similarities it would bear to a gas boiler, currently very widespread in the UK. So what barriers might we face when it comes to hydrogen deployment? Well, I think the main one is supply. The ability to meet demand could be a significant barrier in hydrogen's household use, as there are very limited sources at present, very limited low carbon sources at present, and its use in sectors that are harder to decarbonise, such as aviation or shipping, will likely take priority. At present, low carbon hydrogen is not yet cost competitive, and this poses a major barrier to its deployment. In terms of green hydrogen, this is more expensive to produce than blue, and there might be potential to reduce this from scaling up deployment of renewables and electrolyzers. It would also require a greater capacity of renewable generation and requires more than just if we were to use that electricity directly. So this would place additional demands upon electrification. With regards to blue hydrogen, there's currently no carbon capture and storage facilities in the UK, and CCS in general has not been deployed at the scale that was anticipated. Without CCS, hydrogen derived from methane cannot be low carbon, which is a requirement for a low carbon solution. Hydrogen would also require large volumes of storage to cope with periods of high heating demand, and any associated safety risks with the storage of hydrogen in salt caverns would need to be managed effectively. If hydrogen is used within residents, this is also would require a certain amount of maintaining safety. So whilst no carbon monoxide or dioxide emissions are produced at the point of combustion, the hotter flame temperature reached by hydrogen results in the formation of nitrogen oxides, and this will need to be carefully regulated if it's used in the home. Determining if it's safe for use is an area of priority in the coming years, and this will be aided by further hydrogen trials. Studies by Sadler and Element Energy suggest costs of upwards of £3,000 per property for a hydrogen conversion, and this would include internal pipework, boilers and appliances, and this could be a major barrier in uptake. So when it comes to hydrogen policy, if a hydrogen-based strategy is put in place, policy intervention stands to play a crucial role to ensure its security of supply. The government plans to make a strategic decision in 2026 about the contribution of hydrogen to heating buildings to help achieve net zero. So blending, which blends a certain percentage of hydrogen into natural gas, could help create demand for low carbon hydrogen in domestic settings and would require the adjustment of current regulations, which could help pave the way for a long-term hydrogen solution. However, there are other sectors that might be able to benefit more from this hydrogen used in this. Hydrogen trials have successfully taken place that use the process of blending, the most notably Keele University. There are plans to expand this to a public network in the North East England. In terms of full hydrogen trials, the UK government has outlined its ambition to support full hydrogen heating trials in local neighbourhoods by 2023 through the use of hydrogen boilers, and large villages by 2025. And if these go well, they will build up to a pilot hydrogen town by the end of the decade. In terms of grants and supports, between 2022, so this very year, and 2025, a 240 million net zero hydrogen fund will support the deployment of low carbon hydrogen. This is designed to de-risk private sector investment and lessen the lifetime costs of projects. However, it's unclear how much will go towards domestic heating as opposed to other sectors. Business models are another important aspect. In 2022, so this year, business models to support a hydrogen economy and reduce the cost gap between low carbon hydrogen and fossil fuel derivatives are expected. And lastly, low carbon hydrogen standards. So defining where hydrogen comes from is a very important aspect to make sure that the green hydrogen we use is green. And these need to be in place to develop the market and create a demand to distinguish hydrogen by origin. The government has recently completed a consultation with the aim of defining low carbon hydrogen to create a hydrogen standard. And now I'll pass on to my colleague Richard, who will talk you through the aspects of a heat pump strategy.
Hi, so heat pumps offer a more efficient form of electric heating compared to direct electric heaters, and they therefore also offer low carbon alternatives to natural gas boilers. So heat pumps typically provide space and water heating. Some reversible heat pumps can provide cooling as well. Heat pumps are powered by electricity and allow for the efficient transfer of heat from an external source, such as the air, ground or water, into a building. So process is similar to a fridge operating in reverse. Next slide, please. So in the UK, around 85% of homes are connected to the gas grid, and as of 2020 there was a total stock of 265,000 heat pumps installed. But the government has a target to install 600,000 heat pumps per year from 2028, and previous climate change committee scenarios have suggested that we need heat pumps installed in the order of many millions. And if you look at countries such as France and Sweden have 3 million, 2 million heat pumps installed respectively. And in the chart on the right, the UK performs very poorly in terms of, well, having 7 installed heat pumps per 1,000 households in 2018. And you compare that to the likes of Norway, Sweden and Finland, where the equivalent figure is between 300 and 500 per 1,000 households. In the UK, there's just over 1,000 installation companies. Most of those are likely to be pretty small, and only several manufacturers which produce heat pumps in the UK. By contrast, in terms of boilers in the UK, 55% of demand is met by domestic manufacturers. But since boilers and air conditioners use similar components and require similar skills to heat pump production, there may be some scope for transferability. And indeed, we could learn from some European manufacturers which use the same facilities for air conditioning and heat pump production. Next slide, please. So there's a range of barriers that the report identifies to wider deployment of heat pumps in the UK. So the first is upfront purchase costs. Now, a typical cost of installing an air-to-water heat pump, which is the most common kind in the UK, is around £9,000 at least, and several times the cost of replacing a gas boiler. There have also been a number of financial incentives supporting heat pumps in the UK over the last 15 years. Not least the renewable heat incentive most recently, but this is due to be replaced by boiler upgrade scheme grants, which from the level of funding attached to it would only support around 90,000 heat pump installations. And financial incentives generally have been inconsistent in terms of how they're designed and the scale of support. Another barrier is that in the UK still the electricity price incorporates higher policy costs of decarbonisation, and carbon price in general isn't reflected in natural gas prices, and conversely carbon dioxide emissions from household electricity use in the UK have decreased due to higher installed capacity of renewables. Heat pumps also require competent installation to maximise performance, and there tends to be an issue with heat pumps requiring more space than gas combi boilers. And another issue is the impact on total and peak electricity demand. While heat demand from heat pumps is more distributed across different parts of the day compared to gas boilers, there would still be a need to spread heat demand across the day through thermal storage or smart controls. We also identified in the study some analyses that look at the comparative costs of electrified heat and hydrogen decarbonisation scenarios. So there was analysis done for the Climate Change Committee in 2018, which looked at overall systems costs and concluded that the overall systems costs of making such a transition was similar for electrified heat versus hydrogen heating pathways, but perhaps slightly less for electrification. And then a separate study by the International Council on Clean Transportation, shown in the chart, looked at the annual household cost of different low carbon heat options in 2050 and concluded that heat pumps would have the lowest cost compared to other green or blue hydrogen options. Next slide, please. So a few thoughts on heat policy support for heat pumps. UK, we think, should follow Germany and France by including a carbon price in the cost of gas bills and transferring policy costs from electricity bills to general taxation. In addition to upfront grants, we recommend that the government should support schemes and products which provide access to affordable capital. So these could draw upon examples in France, Germany and Italy, and could include mortgage additions, tax credits and low interest loans. We also recommend that the UK should look to set up a national testing centre for heat pumps, which would both test the performance of heat pump products, but also help to develop new and improved heat pumps. We identified that in Europe, such test centres have been set up on a long-term basis, whereas in the UK, there was a national UK field trial of heat pumps, but this took place quite a long time ago now. And heat pump industry representation is somewhat fragmented. There are, for example, 3 separate heat pump associations. We also note in the report the potential to engage consumers through smart heat and flexibility, for example, through heat as a service business models, whereby customers pay for a specific level of thermal comfort or flexibility. And we note that the potential role of hybrid heat pumps, so these are heat pumps that include either a heat pump component and a gas or hydrogen boiler component. So these could help to manage impacts on electricity demand from heat pumps by switching between electricity and gas or hydrogen. Hybrid heat pumps could take advantage of time of use price differences. So in terms of our final recommendations, beyond those that I already mentioned for heat pumps, we do recommend that the government should support longer term grants than perhaps the boiler upgrade scheme of at least 10 years to increase revenue certainty in the heat pump industry. We also recommend that UK heat pump manufacturing is supported through incentives for UK based manufacturers of complementary technologies such as gas boilers and air conditioners to diversify production to heat pumps. And following the example of others, we recommend the establishment of a heat pump council comprising members from government, regulators, industry and civil society to better help coordinate consumer engagement with heat pumps. And then finally, in addition to further clarity on the role of hybrid heat pumps, we recommend that low carbon hydrogen should be prioritised strategically in hard to electrify sectors, and that the development of electrolyzers should be supported to improve the cost effectiveness of green hydrogen. But our overall conclusion is that over the next 10 years, we should focus on deploying currently available solutions, so including energy efficiency, heat pumps and heat networks. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Amy and Richard, for running us through your paper. I'd now like to introduce our expert panel members. Caroline Bragg is the Director of Policy and Research at the Association for Decentralised Energy. Caroline's responsible for the development of the association's policy work and its research arm, ACE Research, working closely with members and policymakers to promote the sustainable development of the decentralised energy sector in the UK. Caroline has extensive previous experience in the UK energy and housing sectors. Dr. Jan Rosenau is the Principal and Director of European Programmes at the Regulatory Assistance Project. As the Director of European Programmes, Jan leads RAP's initiatives in Europe on power market design and efficiency first. He's responsible for all aspects of leadership, management and financial viability of RAP's work in Europe. Jan serves on the Executive Committee of the International Energy Agency's Demand Side Management Programme and sits on the board of the European Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. And then finally, Dr. Nixon Sunny, researcher from Imperial College. Nixon has a PhD in chemical engineering from Imperial During his PhD, he developed modelling tools to analyse investments in hydrogen and carbon capture infrastructure. He's a frequent speaker at international conferences and has given dozens of technical presentations on multinational Horizon 2020 projects. His areas of expertise include carbon neutral gas and electricity infrastructure design, heating and industrial sectors, sustainability assessments, along with environmental policy and regulation. So having introduced our speakers, I would now invite them to provide their initial comments on the paper for discussion. Caroline, over to you. Thank you.
Fantastic, and thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to have a good discussion today on a really good contribution to this topic. I wanted to say a few introductory remarks. I think firstly, the paper was a very thorough, well-balanced briefing that set out some really interesting recommendations, I think, with a particular focus on the supply chain that was welcome. I wanted to also set out a couple of further points or areas that I think we can explore further during this discussion. The first one I wanted to note was the approach to different parts of the building stock that we are starting to see in policy, and I think will be important going forward. The first one is the impact of the heat and building strategy recommendations on moving more quickly in the off-gas grid sector, which I think is an important part of this discussion. Through the work that came in the consultations that accompanied that strategy, we may now see the start of a ban in terms of refurbishment and replacement to gas boilers starting to happen, say, 2024 to 2026 for domestic and commercial buildings off the gas grid, which, as we've talked about, is about 15%, about 1 million households. I think there's an important and quite interesting discussion to be had about the impact that that might have in terms of cost, as well as building up the supply chain. The other part of that I think is quite important is the role of the public sector in the progress that we need and the impact on some of the barriers that we've that have just been laid out. I think that's got quite a number of parts, but perhaps just to touch on two. The first is the impact in progress in the social housing sector and the role that that could play. We know that the social housing sector has on average slightly higher standards in terms of energy efficiency in particular, and also that the decent home standard, which is the way in which building performance in that sector is managed, is being reviewed. I think finally as well, there's something to be said for the scale that can be achieved through single procurement for the social housing sector through local authorities, which is also quite an interesting part of this discussion. More generally, I think there's a really interesting role going forward in terms of the broader role of public sector procurement and the decarbonisation of its own estates that we should see, I hope, really accelerate its progress this decade and the impact that that might have on some of the barriers and the options that we're talking about today. The other guess a couple of points that I wanted to raise briefly. I think it's very welcome that it was touched upon in the briefing in terms of the impact, but also the opportunity in terms of power sector integration of electrified heat. But I felt like I wanted more a little bit. I think there's quite a lot to unpack within that. If you look, for example, I think at the market framework and the way in which we operate a decarbonised grid, I think there's much more to get into in terms of broader market reform that would allow some of the business models we're talking about, such as heat as a service, to come forward. I think more than that as well, there is I think a larger discussion to be had about the role of heat pump flexibility as well as hot water thermal storage in a fully deeply decarbonised power sector, where instead of generation mostly actually responding to movements in demand during the day and during the season, we'd actually see that flip, and you have demand following the peaks and troughs of the very high levels of variable renewable penetration. The reinforcement thing, I think, is also a really important question. I think the ideas that came up as I was reading the paper are, firstly, I think certainly local reinforcement will be necessary, and we need to think through that carefully. But I think we can't underestimate the extent to which we just don't have granular information about the utilisation of our current networks and where those pockets of reinforcement will come. I think more than that, there is, I think, further discussion and a lot more work in terms of the role of a transmission network in a deeply decarbonised power sector. And whilst it may be that the impact is different, I think we will see very significant need for reinforcement in some areas. And then finally, I appreciate it was out of scope, but I think it is really important to consider with heat networks within this discussion and where heat decarbonisation will eventually go. There was a little sense for me, I have to admit, that it was sort of heat pumps versus heat networks versus hydrogen. And I think what you see when you look at the development of heat networks and the sector going forward is that somewhat mischaracterises where we're going to go. Where we expect to see in 2050 is actually water source, ground source and air source representing the dominant heat sources for heat networks going forward. And I think the real discussion we need to have is where heat electrification, whether that's an individual or a regional based approach, is going to be the right way forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. Jan.
Thanks for having me. I'm speaking to you from my heat pump heated home in Oxford, and I can confirm it's the third winter and we're still warm, even though our house is not a passive house. It's an old Victorian house that is 142 years old. I wanted to touch on an aspect that wasn't part of the scope of the report, but is on everybody's mind, and that is the current spike in energy prices. When we looked at the economics of heat pumps versus gas boilers in the UK last year, this was based on relatively stable residential energy prices. We now have about 3 times higher wholesale electricity and gas prices, and that will feed through into significantly higher domestic energy prices as well, perhaps as much as 56%. That's an estimate by an investment bank in April, depending on what the government does. So how will that affect the economics of both hydrogen and heat pumps, that change in energy prices? So just rerun the calculation this morning with the updated figures, and the result is that it doesn't really change the basic and fundamental barrier which you pointed out in the report, and that is that the running costs of heat pumps, unless you have a very efficient system, it's about a coefficient of performance, which is the efficiency of the heat pump of 4 that you need to sort of break even with a gas boiler. Unless you change the current taxes and levies on energy prices, even with a price rise we've seen now, that is not fundamentally going to change. So there's sort of one observation there. So that is still relevant. However, having said that, of course, with gas prices now being projected to be as much as, I think, 8p per kilowatt hour for gas domestic, which is more than double what they used to be, it's a lot harder politically to argue for shifting levies to gas or put a carbon price on gas. So that is certainly become a lot more difficult. What I would say is, though, there are some other solutions. You could exempt electricity used for heat pumps from levies and potentially taxes, which would cost a lot less than shifting the levies into general taxation for all electricity use. So that's one of the potential ways forward there. What does this mean for hydrogen? And I'm sure that Nixon will talk about this a bit in his intervention, but I know that Nixon and his team has done some work a couple of years back in the autumn, which found hydrogen from gas, so blue hydrogen, to cost about 3 times as much as at that point sort of natural gas prices for domestic customers. I would expect, and I haven't run the numbers on that because of the higher wholesale gas prices, that should also feed through to significantly higher blue hydrogen prices, which in turn makes green hydrogen a lot more attractive. And important there, of course, is that it needs to be produced with dedicated renewables. Otherwise, if it's just grid connected, that hydrogen will then be made with grid electricity, and at the wholesale price, that will not be cheap. So it needs to be dedicated capacity that is being used to make green hydrogen to see the costs come down. So that's, I guess, the long-term observation there is that probably blue is becoming a bit less relevant and green a bit more, especially if prices continue to be high. And the latest projections we've seen from IRENA, for example, I think last week, indicate that green hydrogen is becoming cheaper quite rapidly. I think that's all I wanted to sort of say really in my short intervention. We have to watch this quite carefully. I think the economics will be an important enabler or barrier depending on how we design the system. I look forward to the questions and the discussion.
Great, thank you, Jan. I can assure you there's lots of questions coming in. Nixon, if you could give us your views, please.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks all, and good afternoon. So I'll build on some of the points that Jan mentioned, and I'll start by saying that fuel poverty is a major issue affecting people in the UK, and more broadly, actually. But there were some shocking statistics published in a research briefing in the second half of last year, which said that around 13% of the households in England and Wales are classified as fuel poor, and that increases to somewhere around 18% in Northern Ireland, and going further up to 25% in Scotland. So needless to say, there's an imperative for us to manage the costs during the energy transition. And the recent gas supply crunch has shown that the risks of having 85% of our homes connected to the gas grid when we're not energy independent is a significant risk. And if we remain as net importers of energy, we'll continue to open our economy to these shocks, and consumers will be worse off, as we're seeing right now. So we need to focus on energy security as much as we need to cut carbon emissions. And this might mean that we expand the electrification of heat to not put all our eggs in one basket as we're currently doing. And the important point, though, is that we do this intelligently. We can invest heavily in heat pumps, but that needs to be aligned with wider system transformations. So there's no value in, say, shifting one problem and replacing it with another. If we have low wind or solar outputs in winter, we need to have stable, clean generation sources that can deliver the power loads that we need without necessarily ratcheting up the energy prices. So this means that we need to account for additional storage, transmission, stable generation sources such as nuclear energy and so on. And secondly, I wanted to touch on hydrogen. So having been involved in this research area for a couple of years now, I have reservations about relying on hydrogen to displace all of the natural gas-based heating demand. And the reason is quite simple. The scale of supply investment that you require to replace the entirety of the heating stock is substantial. And it has no historical precedent and will be highly challenging even under the most optimistic scenarios. If we want to deliver the scale that we need for heating, we need to have significant quantities of natural gas and carbon capture. And the primary reason, even though all the points that Jan mentioned, strictly speaking, hold, and the primary reason for this is the global electrolyzer market is currently not mature enough to meet the demands that we need to supply our heating demands. So given that we currently don't have a single large-scale carbon capture plant operating right now, this will be difficult to say the least. And there's no question that we'll need a mixed approach, largely driven by heat pumps. In that case, we urgently need to address the issue of having a suitable workforce. And we need to make sure there are enough installers for the large-scale rollout of heat pumps, and we need to train them today, because right now we have a very, very large workforce that are familiar with going into households and establishments and replacing gas boilers and radiators, etc. And that we need to essentially build up the same level of expertise around heat pumps in UK building stocks. And there needs to be some more policy direction and support in this area to make sure that the jobs are preserved while we're doing this and the economy is not adversely impacted. That's the general gist of what I wanted to say for now, and I'll stop there and pass the mic back to the organisers to invite some questions.
Right, thank you all. As anticipated, three quite different takes on the same topic, but I think I'm going to first off, thank you for all the questions that are coming in. There are a lot. There's simply not enough time to get through the 58 that I've already had come in. So one of the themes that seemed to run through each of what you were saying is issues of costs and how we pay for things, how levies are currently charged on our bills. And so one of the most popular questions that came in was that the paper proposes that energy levies be moved to fossil fuels. What are your views on how that can be achieved equitably? How do we make this transition fair? Caroline.
Sure, yes, I think it's a really interesting one. There was a very, useful Public First report, I think was published last year or the year before, which drew on quite a lot of existing work into this area. I think briefly, the straight switch of those levies from electricity and gas has quite significant distributional impacts, both for those in fuel poverty as well as the broader customer base. And I think that's important to bear in mind when we have this discussion. The other option, which I was pleased to see in this report, is around the introduction of a carbon tax at the domestic gas level, with then a shift of levies onto taxation, which I think, my understanding at least of the analysis that's been done thus far, has fewer distributional impacts associated with it. Yeah, but I think none of the options are totally neutral, I guess, is the other thing I would say. And I think there's still a real question here about what those, particularly in fuel poverty, or those who are close to it, will be expected to pay within this transition.
Okay. Yeah.
I could come in there. I mean, it really requires quite careful and much more detailed analysis, and I'm sure that your base and others are looking into this as we're speaking. You could segment the segment of low-income households, and you would find, for example, that the proportion of those who are on direct electric heating, who are also in fuel poverty, is higher compared to people who use gas for heating. So yes, there might be some people who might benefit from the shift, but of course there would also be examples of people who use a lot of gas because they have very leaky homes, and they might be paying more. For the average customer, though, it's worth pointing out, if you shift the same amount of levies from one fuel to another, if you're an average customer, you're not paying more overall. You're just paying for the levy with a different fuel or energy carrier. But of course, that is not representative of everybody, so it needs much more careful analysis. I think what I suggested, to exempt electricity that's used for heat pumps, is one of the approaches that limits the impact. That's something that could be done very easily, and it wouldn't have a major impact on the overall taxes and levy structure at all, but still provide the incentive that we want to see for people to make the decision to switch away from fossil fuels to a heat pump.
Nixon.
Maybe if I can quickly comment, Richard. So I very much support and build on both of the panelists' views there. And what I'd say that I would firmly believe that a transition of the levies from the electricity directly onto gas is a bad idea. If you did a complete shift, that's a bad idea. And that's for very much the reasons that Jan mentioned. You need to do a detailed analysis of this. And one of the primary reasons we've ended up in this current state of the UK, where we have 85% of our homes connected to the gas network, is because gas was, cheaper for a long period of time. And people have gotten used to it and familiar with it. And if you use a lot of gas currently, and you shift all of the additional externality costs attached to gas directly onto the consumer who's been cushioned away from it for a long time, we're going to see that, the repercussions of that in terms of social costs. So that needs to be flagged and looked at in more detail. But of course, I think this is part of an important strategy. I do believe that you have to start exposing consumers to some of these costs in the long run. So you definitely need to manage this transition, bring in more users for electricity, like heat pump rollout, and then do that in line with policy initiatives of this nature, as opposed to a flat shift of the levies from electricity directly onto gas.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask a follow-up question that's related. Do you think that the public willingness to look at hydrogen for heating has changed with the recent high gas prices? And has this changed your overall opinion of hydrogen as an option? I'll start with you this time, Jan.
I haven't seen any evidence that it has changed. I have seen a recent polling about green hydrogen, which suggested fairly positive sentiments amongst the general public about green hydrogen, but I haven't seen polling that sort of compares, pre-gas prices, post-gas prices changes, what that looks like. So I don't think it has changed. I think with the price of hydrogen, the main issue there is that we just don't know yet how much it's going to cost at scale. we do have projections. They differ. We looked at this in some recent work, and they differ quite a bit. So some people believe costs could come down quite rapidly. People like BNAF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, for example, are more bullish on that. Also IRENA on green hydrogen, and others are more skeptical and believe hydrogen prices will not come down so quickly. So we don't know yet, and I think it needs scaling up. And I actually support the trials that we're doing in the UK. I think it's all very good that we try these technologies, that we find out more about how these technologies work, perform, what their costs. But we have to also at the same time continue the rollout of energy efficiency, heat pumps, solar thermal, other technologies that are already available today, because we can't wait until the mid-2030s when hydrogen might be available at a large scale until we sort of do that. Otherwise, we're running out of time.
Nixon.
Yeah, very much agree with what Jan said, in that I haven't seen any evidence to indicate that the public opinion on this has shifted somewhat. I would say, I guess, from a personal standpoint, if you sort of do your own mental models as to how these things will come about in the real world, you can sort of start to get at the obvious picture is that if you needed to do hydrogen at scale, there's going to be some blue hydrogen in there, and if you needed to rely on natural gas when natural gas costs as high as it costs today, then the obvious outcome is that the hydrogen is going to cost a lot more than what you initially thought. So given that your primary decision may have been made on the fact that hydrogen is cheap, this might be a sufficient, barrier for I guess limiting its attractiveness as it goes along. As it gets more and more expensive, there's less interest and value in relying on that as an option, because if alternative options can deliver that, then we'll have to sort of explore that. So I think that would be the sentiment that I would share, but that's not. I wouldn't actually say that that's the public opinion.
Caroline?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say to build on that is I think within this, and as mentioned in the report, it's very important to remember the context, which is that there is very limited public awareness around the detail of heat decarbonisation at this time, and I think that has some bearing, I think, on the debate.
That's an interesting point. So does that present a barrier to all these discussions around heat pumps versus hydrogen if we're largely talking to a self-interested group of 200 and something attendees on this meeting, where there's 29 million homes in the UK that the Climate Change Committee has said are not fit for the future? How do we sell the transition in any form, whatever it might be?
I think raising awareness is really important, actually, I think that happens on many different levels. You can see across strategies, whether that's Scottish Government or UK strategies, that local bespoke energy advice may well be quite an important part of this transition, and is something that is lacking actually for the most part, and that includes heat decarbonisation as well as energy efficiency that we will need for retrofit. I think then that moves up in terms of the awareness perhaps of those who are working regionally, so local authorities' ability to make progress in their local areas, their expertise in which to do that. And then even at national level, I think we are not quite at the point yet where we are having the debate and the discussion that we need to, outside of, as you say, a dedicated nerd group of the energy industry.
Yeah.
If I may come in just very briefly, I would agree with the premise of the question that there's a lot of work to be done, I think, in terms of having those conversations. What I would also say is, certainly over the last year or couple of years or so, the media coverage of heating as an issue has completely spiraled, and we've seen a significant coverage by all the major newspapers, on television, on the radio, which just wasn't there before. So I think the awareness that heating is something we got to do something about is growing. I think the understanding what the solutions are and exactly what's right for particular properties, I think that is still something that requires an awful lot of work. But I think we're making some inroads in terms of the conversation. It's really moved on from just talking about the power sector. I was getting really sick and tired of just hearing about wind farms and solar farms, and never really people talking about buildings and the massive amount of fuels that we use in that sector. And that has really changed. So I'm very pleased about that.
Okay, next question then. Moving on to a fabric first approach. The most popular question at the moment, do we think that houses should be properly insulated before a heat pump is installed? And I'm going to broaden that to before any type of low carbon heating is installed. And who should take the lead on making the installations happen? Central government, local councils, energy companies, or an other? And Nixon, I'll let you lead on that one.
I don't think there's a crystal clear response to that question, in that there's no immediate advantage to saying that the government should take the lead or the company should deliver energy efficiency improvements. I do believe that it is a no-brainer to improve energy efficiency in households, and it shouldn't just be something that's lumped together with heat pumps, irrespective of whether you use gas, hydrogen, or oil heating or whatever it is. You should be looking to improve the energy efficiency of homes. The fact that it offers benefits to heat pumps is an advantage because of the fact that it allows it to work a lot more efficiently. So it's not a question, but of course, there is additional cost attached with energy efficiency. It's by no means cheap, but in the long run, it does pay for itself, especially given that we're not knocking over buildings that quickly. In terms of who takes ownership, I'd say that's a question of policy, and at this point in time, I wouldn't, I'm not in a position to basically suggest that companies should take the lead or whether government should act on that. What I would say is that at the moment, consumers aren't in a position to immediately support the additional cost attached to it. So there needs to be some provisions made by the government to make sure that the homes and buildings get more and more insulated and become more and more energy efficient. So that's where the public sector needs to step in to provide some degree of financial support. But I have no real strict preference on who takes the lead in the initiative.
Caroline.
Sure. Yes, I think I would certainly build on what we've said so far. I think it's simply not practical to have an extremely dogmatic approach on fabric first. I think, as Nixon says, it certainly makes sense to do the thing together. More than that, I think there are a couple of things to add to this discussion. I think on the regulation side, there are now some really interesting areas being developed. So you can see that in terms of the minimum energy efficiency standards, a stronger focus on, say, mortgage lending and the average EPC achieved through those portfolios. And I think if that doesn't start to look at energy efficiency and heat together, we are missing an opportunity there. I think more than that as well, I think it's important to think about the sort of trigger points and the way in which this will happen. For example, that you can see, for example, in for example, the private rented sector, a natural trigger point is going to be when it is your change of tenant, for example, and that might be the same in the owner occupier sector. If that's where you're really pushing, then I think a more whole house retrofit approach, and where we're starting to see that, for example, in PAS standards now, should naturally be the way forward. But I think you could see a sort of slightly more gradual approach happening in terms of boiler replacement, for example.
Yeah, do you want to come in on that, or we?
Yes, I mean, I just wanted to reinforce a point that Nixon made about energy efficiency being a necessity for any heating system. I sometimes find that the discussion that we're having suggests that you need to do energy efficiency if you have a heat pump, but you don't need to do it if you have a gas boiler, an oil boiler, or a hydrogen boiler, or something else. And I just fundamentally disagree with that premise, because when you talk to engineers, heating engineers, which I do regularly on social media, they will tell you that most condensing boilers in the UK don't condense because the flow temperatures that they are being set at are too high. And a low flow temperature requires decent levels of insulation, larger emitters to keep us warm. And that is something that we should be doing anyway, regardless of the fuel that's being used. And therefore, I think the question really applies to all fuels. Who should deliver it? I think what is missing in the UK for a long time now is a well-funded energy efficiency retrofit program that includes both fabric efficiency measures but also heating system improvements. We had several failed attempts, the Green Deal, the Green Homes Grant, that really have undermined confidence in the industry, in the technology. But it's a well-established technology that exists in many different places and has been applied very successfully. So I think what is missing is that longevity of policy and stability. Just looked at what Germany did last year. I think they had loans granted for 27 billion euros investment in domestic buildings alone for energy efficiency upgrades. So there is certainly potential to do a lot more, but we need that policy clarity, and currently we just don't have that.
Okay, well, with a nod to time, I'm going to ask you to give a very quick answer on a question of timescales. So we've talked about heat pumps, not hydrogen, for the next decade. The government's got a target of 600,000 by 2028. It took France a decade to triple their installation numbers. Germany went up 25% last year, but we're still talking of 140,000. How do we get from 35,000 now to 600,000 in 6 years, whilst also trying to accommodate this growth in what we're assuming to be hopefully green hydrogen? And it's going to have to be quick because we're almost done. Nixon.
As a very quick response, I think we need to retrain a lot of workers. We need to provide them with the skills, and we need to make sure that there are the opportunities in place to allow them to essentially maximize their outputs. And
okay,
that's
I'm going to stop you there, Nixon. Caroline. Brutal.
A preemptive approach to the supply chain was going to be mine too.
And finally, yeah.
Well, we've actually written a whole report about that particular question, how to get to the Prime Minister's target of 600,000 heat pumps. You can find it on our website, online.org.
Brilliant. Thank you for that very speedy response to the last question. Okay, well, we're almost out of time, so I'd just like to thank our expert panel for their time this afternoon. It's a topic of such crucial importance, and we are grateful for you all taking the time to share your views with us this afternoon, so thank you. Thank you finally to Energy Futures Lab and Imperial College Consultants for producing such a comprehensive review on the future of home heating. As the report makes clear, in the move towards decarbonising home heating, the government should focus on deploying solutions which are available now, including heat pumps, energy efficiency and heat networks, and introduce new support to make heat pump technologies more affordable for householders. To end this afternoon's session, I'm going to quote Richard Hanna, one of the report's authors, who says, "With further investment in research and demonstration, hydrogen has potential to help decarbonise challenging sectors like industry and shipping. But right now, there is not a strong case for using it to heat our homes. In the near term, government should focus its efforts on improving heat pump products and their affordability and supporting industry to rapidly scale up production of technology in the UK." And on that note, I would like to thank you all for attending and have a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.